Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to be doing the next part of the book that I started in my last video, and it's regarding the Tudors and Stuarts, and it's taken from the box set The Usborne History of Britain. Okay, so in the last video we were discussing Elizabeth I, and we're continuing in Elizabeth I's world, and this page discusses the Golden Age. At Elizabeth's court, art and culture flourished, and people called it a golden age. Poets such as John Donne and Edmund Spenser composed great works of literature. The Queen encouraged talented musicians to give concerts in private houses and playhouses. She also loved plays and had performances put on at court specially for her entertainment. There's a side panel about entertainment in Elizabethan times. In Tudor times, wealthy people enjoyed concerts, recitals, banquets, and dancing, and you can see some people dancing there. Meanwhile, poorer people had their own entertainment. One common sport was bear baiting, in which people watched bears fighting with dogs. Can't imagine that being very entertaining. Awful. People also held cockfights. Large bets were placed on which cock would win. Plays became more and more popular during Elizabeth's reign. They were one of the few forms of entertainment that could be enjoyed by both rich and poor. And there's a lovely picture of Shakespeare's Globe Playhouse with part of the wall cut away so you can see inside. At the bottom here it says, "Groundlings pay a small price to stand and watch the play. Higher up, the seats are more expensive." William Shakespeare. Elizabethan writers such as Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson produced brilliant plays that are still performed today. But the greatest writer of them all was William Shakespeare. He wrote at least 36 plays, acting in many of them, and he is now one of the most famous writers of all time. And there's a picture of our Shakespeare. Performances. Shakespeare put his plays on at the Globe, a playhouse in London that held up to 3,000 people. These performances were very different from modern productions. The actors had to shout to be heard over the noisy audience. Women were played by male actors wearing wigs and dresses. Actors in fight scenes used real weapons and sometimes seriously injured each other. Cannons were sometimes fired on stage, and on one occasion this set the building on fire. It says gatherers stand at the door with boxes to collect admission money. Shakespeare's plays. Shakespeare's plays included romances such as Romeo and Juliet. "O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?" tragedies like Hamlet, To Be or Not to Be, that is the question, and dramatic versions of British history such as Henry V. Once more onto the breach, dear friends. Moving to the towns. While Elizabeth's courtiers enjoyed new art, music and literature, life was getting harder for the poor people of England. The population had been rising during the Tudor period, and by the time of Elizabeth's reign there weren't enough jobs to go around, especially in the countryside, where landowners were fencing off more and more land for their flocks of sheep. Many people decided to pack their bags and head to the nearest town in search of employment. Swollen by these new arrivals, towns expanded rapidly, becoming dirty and overcrowded. Competition for jobs was fierce, and whole families were often forced into begging or stealing just to stay alive. A bit on the side here about the Poor Law. In England and Wales, the Elizabethan Poor Law made sure that all districts provided work for the poor and shelter for those who couldn't work. The poor were divided into categories. The impotent poor were those who were considered too old, young, or sick to work. The able-bodied poor were those who were unable to find work. Sturdy rogues were those who could work but chose not to. They were thought to be lazy and dangerous and were punished. Living in towns. Towns bustled with activity, and some people found work in new industries such as glass and paper making and book printing. Farmers could sell their produce in noisy open-air markets, and merchants traded all kinds of goods, such as wool and iron. Exotic merchandise from all over the world flowed into ports such as London and Bristol, for the few who could afford it. For most people, though, even soap was a luxury. There was no running water, and household waste was usually simply dumped in the street. Fleas, rats and flies were attracted to the crowded streets. The filth and vermin caused deadly diseases such as smallpox and tuberculosis to spread quickly. By 1600, London had a population of over 200,000. It was by far the biggest city in Britain and one of the greatest trading cities in Europe. But it was also one of the filthiest places in the world. Crime and punishment. With so many townspeople jobless and desperate for money, crime was common. There was no real police force in the 16th century, but local constables enforced laws, and town magistrates handed out harsh punishments. Anyone found begging without permission was flogged. Murderers and thieves were hanged. Nobles who were accused of treason were beheaded, and people who spoke against the church could be burned alive. Dishonest people were were locked in a wooden frame called a pillory, where people could throw things at them. You see the little picture there. This picture shows a typical town in Elizabethan England. It was against the law to kill large birds, such as ravens. They were needed to eat waste in the streets. Streets were narrow and dirty. This farmer has come to sell bales of wool. That's the market, and there's a pickpocket being arrested. Some market stalls. Most buildings have tiled roofs and are made of wooden frames filled with plaster. Exploring the world. In 1492, an Italian explorer named Christopher Columbus landed in America. At first, Europeans called it the New World because they hadn't even known that it existed before. This was the start of a great age of European exploration. In 1498, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama found a sea route from Europe to the East Indies, which was rich with fine silks and spices. Meanwhile, Spaniards were busy setting up colonies in the New World. By Elizabeth's time, their ships were sailing back and forth across the Atlantic, bringing home vast quantities of gold and silver from South and Central America and the West Indies. Exotic goods. Elizabethan explorers brought back exotic goods that had never been seen before in England. Sir Walter Raleigh brought back potatoes, but at first people tried to eat them raw. Sir John Hawkins brought back tobacco, but his servant saw him smoking and poured water on him, thinking his master was on fire. English adventurers. Envious of Spain's growing riches, Elizabeth encouraged her sailors to search for new lands and treasures too. Sir Walter Raleigh hunted for gold in South America, while Sir John Hawkins sailed from Africa to the New World, bringing African slaves to work in the West Indies. Elizabeth also gave her sea captains permission to attack foreign treasure ships, although this made them very unpopular with the Spaniards. And if you can see that picture there, it's a replica of St. Francis Drake's flagship, the Golden Hind. Among these captains was a man named Francis Drake. He was so feared by the Spaniards that they nicknamed him El Drac, the Dragon. To them he was just a pirate, but to the English he was a hero. In 1577, Drake set sail across the Atlantic Ocean to plunder Spanish ships and settlements in South and Central Africa. Some of his ships were lost in stormy seas, but he continued on into the Pacific Ocean, then to the East Indies and Africa, before returning home laden with silver, gold, and pearls that he had looted from the Spaniards. The journey took 3 years, but Francis Drake became the first Englishman to sail all the way round the world. And there's a map which shows Drake's progress. So he literally sailed all over the world. Yeah, fabulous. Quite a feat in those times. There's a picture here, and it says Elizabeth came to meet Drake on board the Golden Hind, where he was knighted for his services to his country. Rival queens. In England, while Protestants were enjoying religious freedom, Catholics were being forced to pay fines and were even banned from holding religious services. Most of them felt they could do nothing about this, but some were determined to turn England into a Catholic country again. And this meant replacing Elizabeth with a Catholic monarch. As it happened, there was an ideal candidate, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland, who was Elizabeth's cousin. And there's an early portrait of Mary, Queen of Scots. Catholic painters usually made her look beautiful, as she appears here, while Protestant artists made her look ugly. Mary in Scotland. When Mary took up power in Scotland in 1561, after the death of her French husband, the Scots were suspicious of her. They were fiercely Protestant and were scared that Mary might try to impose her Catholic faith on them. Since she had spent most of her early years in France, they also saw her as a foreigner who knew nothing of their country. Mary soon won them over. She married a handsome Scottish nobleman, Lord Darnley, and although she held Catholic services for herself, she made no attempt to interfere with the country's religion. For a while, her subjects were content, but that changed quickly. A murder for a murder. Within months of her marriage, Mary discovered that the dashing Lord Darnley was little more than a bullying drunkard. He grew jealous of his wife and angry at her close relationship with her secretary, David Rizzio. In 1566, Darnley joined a plot to kill Rizzio and helped to stab him to death. Mary never recovered from the shock of this murder and grew to hate her husband. A year later, Darnley was strangled to death, and most people thought that Mary was involved. There was a scandal, and Mary had to abdicate and flee to England. Catholic plots. As soon as Mary arrived in England, Catholics began plotting to put her on the English throne. Elizabeth had no choice but to keep Mary locked up. Her ministers advised her to execute Mary, but Elizabeth didn't want to kill a queen, especially her own cousin. One of these ministers, Sir Francis Walsingham, ran a network of spies to uncover plots. A firm Protestant, he was desperate to prove that Mary was guilty of treason. In 1586, one of the spies gave him a coded letter from Mary to a Catholic plotter, in which she agreed to have Elizabeth killed. This finally convinced the Queen of England to have her rival beheaded. There's a picture there, and it says Mary's pet dog went with her to the execution, hidden under her dress. Poor thing. The Babington Plot. Mary was executed in 1587 for her part in the Babington Plot, masterminded by a wealthy young Catholic, Anthony Babington. Babington planned for Elizabeth to be murdered and for a Spanish army to invade England. But amongst the plotters was one of Walsingham's spies. He revealed that the plotters were sending messages to each other hidden inside beer barrels. Babington and his conspirators were imprisoned and put to death. Soon after that, Mary was tried and executed at Fotheringay Castle. So, I said yesterday that on the back it was the Gunpowder Plot, but it was the Babington Plot, so it's the wrong time period for the Gunpowder Plot. The Spanish Armada. Almost immediately after Mary's execution, Elizabeth faced another threat, this time from Philip II of Spain. He had become angry about Spanish raids on English raids on Spanish ships in the Caribbean, especially as his spies had found that Elizabeth was taking a share of the treasure herself. To add to his fury, she was also helping Protestants in the Spanish-controlled Netherlands to rebel against him. Philip turned on the Queen, whom he had once wanted to marry, and decided to go to war. Plans of attack. In 1587, Philip planned to send a vast fleet of ships, known in Spanish as an armada, to the Netherlands. There it would pick up a Spanish army of 30,000 men and ferry them over the English Channel to invade England. But there was an unexpected setback. English spies discovered Philip's plans, and Sir Francis Drake raided the Spanish port of Cadiz, where the Armada was assembling. There he burned many ships before they had even set sail. It is said that Drake boasted that he had singed the King of Spain's beard. As a side note, facing the Armada. Legend has it that when news reached England that the Armada was approaching, Sir Francis Drake was playing a game of bowls. He is supposed to have remarked casually, "We have time to finish this game and beat the Spaniards too." Elizabeth I delivered a great speech to the English army at Tilbury Fort to encourage them to fight hard. "I know I have but the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart of a king, and of a king of England too." Fire ships. When the Armada finally set sail in July 1588, it was met by an English fleet led by Lord Howard of Effingham, with Drake as his vice-admiral. They hounded the Spanish ships as they sailed up the English Channel. The Spaniards took shelter in the French port of Calais, but in the dead of night the English set fire to 8 of their own ships and sent them crashing into the enemy fleet. This drove the Spaniards into the open sea, where the English were waiting to attack them. I think there's a picture there. The English fire ships were old or worn-out ships loaded with firewood and tar. They caused little damage, but a lot of panic. The cannons on the fire ships were loaded. There was no crew to fire them, but the flames set them off anyway. Victory. On August the 8th, 1588, the river fleets met at the Battle of Gravelines near Calais. The English destroyed several Spanish ships, but could not defeat the Armada entirely. Then, the next day, strong winds drove the Spaniards north before they had a chance to pick up Philip's army in the Netherlands. They were forced to sail around Scotland and Ireland and back to Spain, with storms wrecking many of their ships along the way. In London, crowds cheered as Elizabeth gave a speech thanking God for the victory. Many Protestants saw their success as a sign that God was on their side. And there's a little map of the Armada in Ireland. It says many Spanish ships were wrecked on the coast of Ireland. Around 5,000 Spaniards were drowned or killed by local Irishmen. A Stuart king. In 1603, the great Queen Elizabeth died without any children, and the Tudor dynasty came to an end. Her successor was James IV of Scotland, the son of Mary Stuart. Now, he was also James I, the first Stuart king of England. For the first time, Scotland, England, Ireland, and Wales were ruled by the same monarch. James and the English. The English were excited about their new king, but James soon made himself unpopular by surrounding himself with Scottish courtiers and tactlessly ignoring English customs. To make matters worse, James was a fierce defender of the divine rights of kings. This was the idea that a king's power came from God, and nobody could question his decisions. His ideas often offended members of Parliament who wanted more power in government. And there's the flag of Great Britain. England and Scotland remained two separate nations under James, but he was the first to use the term Great Britain, and he even created a new flag, the Union Jack, out of the English and Scottish flags. And there's James I. James loved to lecture his subjects. He called himself the great schoolmaster of the whole land, and he hoped to convert everyone to his Protestant beliefs. This upset some Catholics, who were disappointed that the son of Mary Stuart would not let them worship in peace. It wasn't long before a number of Catholics began plotting against the king. One group came up with a particularly daring plan to use gunpowder to blow up the Houses of Parliament with James inside. It says here that the portrait shows James in fine clothing. He was so scared of being assassinated that he had his clothing specially padded in case he was stabbed. A date to remember. But one of the conspirators warned a fellow Catholic, Lord Monteagle, to stay away from Parliament. Monteagle told the authorities at once. At midnight on the 5th of November 1605, soldiers searched the cellars beneath the Houses of Parliament and found Guido, or Guy Fawkes, one of the conspirators, with barrels of gunpowder. The plotters were rounded up and hanged. The date went down in British history and is now celebrated every year with bonfire and fireworks. Fighting with Parliament. Meanwhile, Parliament was getting more and more frustrated with the king, who loved to show off his royal power and fritter away money on his friends. This was especially offensive to a group of extreme Protestants known as Puritans, who thought that people should work hard and live a simple life. James's quarrels with Parliament grew more and more serious, and when his son Charles became king in 1625, the situation reached a crisis point. And this print shows the gunpowder plot conspirators. Their leader was Robert Catesby, who is second from the right. Guy Fawkes stands next to him, and there's all the different names. And I actually went to York back in September, and I went into the Guy Fawkes Inn, which is where Guy Fawkes was allegedly born. They said it was in what is now the beer garden, so it was quite interesting, and they had this picture up above the fireplace. And this says torture. After his arrest, Guy Fawkes was tortured in the Tower of London. He was then made to sign his name on a confession, but was barely able to write. So that's the signature after the torture at the top. And that's the signature 8 days later after he's recovered. So it shows how bad it must have been. Brutal times. or Parliament. Charles I was a shy, dignified young man who stammered when he spoke. Like his father James, he believed firmly in the divine right of kings and relied on his friends for advice. This infuriated many MPs who thought that the king should consult them on important matters. The Puritans in Parliament were also worried that Charles wanted to make England Catholic again, since the king was married to the Catholic French princess Henrietta Maria. They grew even more concerned when Charles appointed his friend William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury. Although he was a Protestant, Laud hated Puritans and brought in grand church ceremonies that seemed Catholic in style. There's a little bit on the side, Laud and the Puritans. William Laud tried to stamp out Puritanism. Puritan priests were horribly punished. One Puritan lawyer, William Prine, was branded and had his ears cut off. In 1620, a group of Puritans known as the Pilgrims set sail for North America. They wanted to worship as they pleased, and so they set up a colony there and named it New England. In 1644, Prine had his revenge. He oversaw the trial of Laud for treason. The next year, Laud was beheaded. Charles in charge. Soon after coming to the throne, Charles needed to raise money to fight wars in Europe, but Parliament refused to help him. For a while, the king angrily dismissed Parliament every time its members argued with him or tried to get rid of his advisers. Eventually, he grew so fed up that he sent the MPs home for good. From 1629 to 1640, Charles ruled and raised money without calling Parliament. But this 11 years' tyranny ended when he tried to introduce Laud's church ceremonies in Scotland, together with a new prayer book. Unfortunately for Charles, most Scots were Presbyterians. Their beliefs were similar to those of the Puritans, and they hated Laud's grand style of Protestantism. They also objected to Charles interfering in their country because they saw him as a foreigner. The National Covenant. In churches all over Scotland, angry mobs rioted and attacked clergymen. Thousands vowed to fight religious change and signed the National Covenant, a document which attacked Laud's ideas. Charles had lost control, and before long the Scots were threatening war. In 1640, the king was finally forced to recall Parliament and ask for money to raise an army. This portrait by Van Dyck shows Charles I elegantly dressed. Many MPs disapproved of his extravagance, which cost the country a lot of money. Parliament's revenge. The new Parliament knew that the king needed its help and exploited the situation. Laud was arrested, together with the Earl of Stratford, one of the king's chief advisers. A group of MPs, led by the devout Puritan John Pym, brought in laws to reduce the king's powers. One law required him to call Parliament every 3 years. The road to war. Charles was enraged by these plans to limit his authority. In January 1642, he burst into the House of Commons and demanded the arrest of Pym and the 4 other leading MPs who had opposed him. But they had been warned and had already escaped. Charles left London, raised an army of royalist supporters and declared war. His opponents, the parliamentarians, prepared to fight against him. Throughout England, families, villages, and towns decided which side to join. The Civil War had begun. The Civil War. For 7 years, bloody battles raged between parliamentarians and the royalists. The war involved almost everyone in Britain, and many families were torn apart by arguments over which side to join. Most Puritans fought for Parliament, while Catholics were mainly royalists. The City of London and the Navy sided with Parliament, which gave its armies a huge advantage. They had the wealth of the capital at their disposal and could move troops by ship, which was much faster than marching by land. And this map shows which areas mainly supported Parliament and which supported the king at the outbreak of war in 1642. So, very split there, clear divide. This scene here is a reenactment of the Battle of Edge Hill, the first battle of the Civil War. Cavalrymen fought on horseback. Foot soldiers fought with long pointed wooden pikes. Musketeers used guns called muskets, which were heavy and could be used as clubs in hand-to-hand fighting. Push of pike. In battle, large blocks of soldiers with pikes advanced and tried to push the other side back. If one side broke, most of them would be killed. I don't know if you can see, it is called a hedgehog. When enemy cavalry attacked, foot soldiers formed a hedgehog, with the musketeers in the middle and the pikemen around the edge. The fight for London. The king raised his standard at Nottingham Castle to declare war. But as soon as it was up, a gust of wind blew it over. Many saw this as a bad omen. All the same, Charles set about preparing to fight. He made Oxford his base, gathered his army, and headed for London. He was determined to capture the capital. The first big battle took place at Edge Hill. The Royalists were helped by Charles's nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, who was a brilliant cavalry commander. But the parliamentarians managed to stop the king's army from reaching London. Marston Moor. Meanwhile, Charles's enemy John Pym made a deal with the Scots. They would send an army to join forces with Parliament. In return, Parliament would establish the Presbyterian Church in England. In 1644, the combined Scottish and Parliamentarian army met the King's Cavaliers at Marston Moor. It was the biggest and bloodiest battle of the war. The Royalists lost, and Parliament won control of northern England. And we've got Roundheads and Cavaliers. Royalists called parliamentarian soldiers Roundheads because they cut their hair short and wore helmets. The parliamentarians called their enemies Cavaliers, after the French word chevalier, meaning a knight. They thought that Cavaliers were vain and arrogant. Victory and defeat. After the Battle of Marston Moor, the Royalists were all but defeated. Charles had missed his chance to capture London and win the war. And now he was running out of money. His soldiers were mostly local troops who did not want to travel too far away from their homes, and this meant that he couldn't move his armies around freely. Meanwhile, the parliamentarian army was getting even stronger. An MP named Oliver Cromwell persuaded Parliament to create a new model army, made up of professional soldiers who were fiercer and tougher than the untrained royalist troops. In 1645, the new model army was put to the test when it faced the King's army at the Battle of Naseby. Cromwell's soldiers crushed their opponents, and the royalists fled. The Battle of Naseby was the end for Charles. Soon afterwards, he gave himself up to the Scots, hoping for protection. But in 1647, they handed him over to Parliament. It looked as if the war had been won. Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan who became MP for Huntingdon in 1628. When war broke out, he joined the army and rose rapidly through the ranks. He led the Parliamentarian cavalry at Marston Moor and at Naseby. Unlike Charles, the Puritan Oliver Cromwell did not want to be flattered in paintings. This portrait shows him warts and all, with a red face and a shiny nose. The Second War. Charles had one last chance to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. While he was imprisoned at Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight, the king persuaded the Scots to change sides and join the royalists. But it was all in vain. In 1648, the final battle of the Civil War was fought at Preston. It was another resounding victory for the new model army. The King on Trial. The leaders of the new model army thought Charles was too dangerous to be kept alive. They saw this alliance with Scotland as treason and argued that he should be put on trial. But Charles claimed that the courts had no right to try the king. A vote was held in Parliament to decide whether there should be a trial. That day, Cromwell's soldiers surrounded the House of Commons, keeping out any MPs they thought would vote against trying the king. Cromwell and his allies had already decided on the verdict. Charles was sentenced to death and the monarchy abolished. On January the 30th, 1649, King Charles I was beheaded outside the banqueting house in London. There was no rejoicing. As the blow fell, the crowd let out a huge groan. Many sobbed openly. Rule by Parliament. For the first time in 1,000 years, the country had no monarch. Instead, it was ruled by Parliament, led by Oliver Cromwell, who had risen from the middle classes to become the most powerful man in the land. His rule came to be known as the Commonwealth. Trial and execution. No one wanted to be the man to sentence Charles to death. In the end, John Bradshaw reluctantly agreed to be judge at the king's trial. Bradshaw was so scared of being assassinated that he wore this hat, lined with steel to stop bullets. The day of Charles's execution was freezing cold. Proud until the end, he asked for an extra shirt to wear so the crowd wouldn't think he was shivering with fear. Having a quick drink. The Commonwealth. Although the king was dead, there were still many royalists in Ireland and Scotland who hoped to put his son Charles Stuart on the throne. Cromwell dealt with them swiftly and brutally. First he took the New Model Army to Ireland and killed thousands of Irish royalists, many of whom were Catholic. Meanwhile, Scottish royalists crowned Charles King of Scotland and invaded England. Cromwell returned from Ireland and crushed them at the Battle of Worcester. Charles himself managed to escape to France, where he stayed in exile, waiting for a chance to return. Lord Protector. With his opponents defeated, Cromwell gave himself the title of Lord Protector and ruled England for 5 years until his death in 1658. Just like Charles I before him, he often argued with Parliament and dismissed it. Unlike Charles, though, he had a powerful army on his side. In 1655, there was yet another royalist uprising, and Cromwell decided that he needed to keep a closer watch over his people. He divided England into 11 districts, each one ruled by a major general. Then he set about enforcing Puritan values all over the land. He closed down inns and playhouses and banned popular pastimes such as bear baiting and traditional activities, including maypole dancing. People were fined for being drunk, for gambling, and even playing sports. Escape. After Cromwell won the Battle of Worcester, Charles Stuart had lots of adventures while trying to escape. He cut his hair and pretended to be a woodsman. He hid in priest holes, secret rooms in Catholic people's houses, used to hide priests in time of persecution. He even spent a day hiding in an oak tree. Many pubs in England are named Royal Oak in memory of Charles's hiding place. Life under Cromwell. Most people were scared of Cromwell's army and hated the dull Puritan lifestyle. The Lord Protector even banned Christmas and Easter celebrations and replaced them with days of fasting. But in many other ways, life got much better. For one thing, Cromwell allowed people to worship in almost any way they wished. For another, many people were becoming richer as overseas trade thrived, especially the trade in sugar and slaves with the West Indies. When Cromwell died, his son Richard became Lord Protector. But Richard had nothing like his father's character, and he couldn't control Parliament or the army. Before long, the army took matters into its own hands and invited Charles I's son back from exile in France to become King Charles II. Oliver Cromwell had worked hard to make England into what he saw as a better place. But after his strict Puritan Commonwealth, almost everyone was excited about having a king on the throne again. Puritan England. Cromwell stripped churches of decoration, paintings, statues, and stained glass windows. His soldiers even raided people's houses to take away their Christmas dinner. And this painting shows the Puritan family of Henry Chorley, a cloth merchant from Preston. Puritans wore simple, plain clothes, unlike the extravagant outfits of Charles I's court. Even the small children are wearing the same, aren't they? Look very miserable. The Merry Monarch. Charles II couldn't have been more different from Cromwell. A fun-loving king, he soon earned the nickname the Merry Monarch. He was cultured too, and encouraged science, art, drama, and music to flourish. Charles introduced champagne to Britain. Well done, Charles. Reopened the playhouses that Cromwell had banned and sparked a fashion for sailing when he and his brother raced their yachts down the River Thames. Carefree and airfree. The king was charming and good-looking, with an eye for the ladies. He was married to a Portuguese princess, Catherine of Braganza, but had a string of affairs with many different women. His mistresses produced 14 children between them, but none of them could be heir to the throne. The Queen didn't have any children, so Charles would be succeeded by his brother James. Crime pays. In 1671, a man named Colonel Blood disguised himself as a priest and tried to steal the crown jewels. He was caught. When he was caught, he demanded to see the king. Charles was so impressed by his bravery and his amusing stories that he not only pardoned him, but rewarded him with a pension and some land. And this big painting down here, this shows Charles entering London the day before his coronation. He is wearing a tall hat and riding a white horse. Looks very grand, doesn't he? Lots of entourage. Problems with Parliament. At the beginning of his reign, Charles was careful to build a good relationship with Parliament because he didn't want to risk another civil war. But soon he began to clash with MPs over religion. They wanted to make sure that the country would remain Protestant, and many believed that Charles was secretly a Catholic. Charles was certainly sympathetic to Catholics. He was trying to persuade Parliament to give them more rights, and his brother had converted to Catholicism. Then, in 1670, Charles made a secret deal with Louis the 16th, 14th of France in exchange for money. He promised to become a Catholic and to help the French in their war against the Dutch. When gossip spread about the deal through Parliament, many MPs felt that Charles could not be trusted. Party politics. James was even less popular than his brother, and some MPs were determined to stop him from succeeding to the throne. Politicians became so divided on the matter that they formed two political parties. The MPs who supported James were called Tories, and those who were against him were called Whigs. They were the first political parties in Britain. The plague. When Charles came to the throne, London was a dirty, overcrowded city. Rats thrived in the grimy conditions, and diseases spread very easily. In the summer of 1665, just 4 years into Charles's reign, London was ravaged by a deadly disease called the bubonic plague. The plague germs were carried by fleas which lived in the fur of black rats. Fleas passed the plague, also known as the Black Death, to humans when they bit them. Within days of being bitten, black blotches and huge painful lumps would appear on victims' bodies. Sometimes their fingers, toes, and noses turned black and fell off. They would writhe in agony for days, vomiting and shaking before they finally died. Bring out your dead. Nobody knew what caused the plague or how to cure it. So anybody who showed symptoms was locked in their house with their family and left to die. A red cross was painted on the door to warn others to stay away. Many people starved as they could not leave their houses to find food. At night, men would roam the streets with huge carts, crying, "Bring out your dead." Corpses were loaded up and driven away to enormous burial pits on the outskirts of the city. Eventually, the cold winter weather killed off the fleas, and the plague began to die down. But the Black Death had killed 68,000 Londoners, around 1 in 5 of the population. In this picture, the plague is depicted as a skeleton dancing on coffins with London in the background. Ring-a-ring-a roses, pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. This nursery rhyme is said to be about the Black Death. Victims would show symptoms such as red rashes on the body, ring of roses, and sneezing, a tissue, before falling down dead. See this picture. Doctors wore leather robes with hoods and gloves. Their masks had glass eye holes and beaks stuffed with herbs, which was supposed to protect them from the plague. Almost like COVID times. Samuel Pepys. Much of what we know about the plague comes from the diary of Samuel Pepys. He was an MP and an administrator for the Navy. He wrote in his diary almost every day between 1660 and 1669, and kept detailed notes on everything from his private life to public events, including the coronation of Charles II. Pepys' diary tracks the spread of the plague and gives a very personal account of the tragedy. On the 10th of August 1665, he rushed home to write his will, realising that a man cannot depend upon living 2 days to an end. But by September the 3rd, he was more concerned that his new wig would go out of fashion, for nobody will dare to buy any hair for fear of the infection, that it had been cut off the heads of people dead of the plague. And there's some extracts from Samuel Pepys' diary. June the 7th, 1665. This day I did in Drury Lane see 2 or 3 houses marked with a red cross upon the doors, and Lord have mercy upon us writ there, which was a sad sight to me, being the first of that kind that to my remembrance I ever saw. October the 16th, 1665. Lord, how empty the streets are, and melancholy so many poor sick people in the streets, full of sores, and so many sad stories overheard as I walk. Everybody talking of this dead and that man sick. November the 22nd, 1665. I heard this day that the plague is come very low, that 600 and odd, and great hopes of a further decrease, because of this day's being a very exceeding hard frost, and continues freezing. Just gonna have a quick drink. London's burning. Just as people started to feel safe in London again, a second disaster struck. In the early hours of September the 2nd, 1666, a fire started in a bakery on Pudding Lane, in the heart of the city. It was a hot, dry summer, with strong winds that fanned the flames. The great fire, as it became known, raged for 4 days, destroying 4/5 of London. Panic spreads. At first, no one thought the fire was very serious. Sir Thomas Bloodworth, the Lord Mayor of London, was irritated when he was woken in the middle of the night and told about the fire. Pish, he said, and thinking the fire would be easy to put out, he went back to bed. But as he slept, the fire raged on. By morning, hundreds of houses had already been destroyed. Most of the shops and houses in London were made of wood, and they were tightly packed together, so it was easy for the flames to spread. There was no fire service, and very few people had water in their homes to throw on the flames. Panic-stricken Londoners rushed to the river to fill buckets with water, but the fire was impossible to control. The stones of St. Paul's flew like grenades, the lead melting down the streets and in the stream, and the very pavements glowing with fiery redness, so as nor horse nor man was able to tread on them. John Evelyn, a writer and gardener, describes the destruction of St. Paul's Cathedral during the Great Fire of London in his diary. We can see the picture of London burning. Londoners flee to the south side of the river to escape the flames, throwing their belongings into boats in the hope they survive the fire. Tearing down the houses. King Charles insisted on pulling down as many buildings as possible to stop the fire from spreading to the Tower of London. The city's supply of gunpowder was kept there. If the fire had reached it, the consequences would have been catastrophic. In the midst of the chaos, Pepys bumped into the Lord Mayor in the street. Now wide awake, Pepys wrote that he cried like a fainting woman. "Lord, what can I do? I am spent. People will not obey me. I have been pulling down houses, but the fire overtakes us faster than we can do it." The aftermath. By September the 6th, the fire had died down, and shaken Londoners began to return to the city. But there was a silver lining to this tragedy. The fire killed the last of the rats and fleas which were carrying the plague, so the city was finally free of the Black Death. Lucky escape. Officially, only 9 people died in the fire, but it is likely that there were many other deaths which went unrecorded. This painting shows the Tower of London glowing in the light of the flames. Luckily, the fire never reached the tower. Wealthy Stuarts. Charles was determined to prevent such a fire from happening again, and so he ordered London to be rebuilt with stone instead of wood. The architect, Sir Christopher Wren, was commissioned to design the new look London. Narrow winding streets were to be replaced with wide paved avenues. But many of the plans had to be scrapped as there wasn't enough money to cover the costs. Even so, London was transformed. The most famous new landmark was Wren's magnificent St. Paul's Cathedral. And there's a portrait of Sir Christopher Wren with St. Paul's Cathedral in the background. The arches and domes are in the Baroque style, influenced by Italian Renaissance architects. The rich get richer. This new London reflected the profound opulence of England under Charles II. While life for the poor remained much the same, life for the wealthy was improving rapidly. After the dull lifestyle of the Commonwealth, those who could afford it took advantage of their new freedom. Clothing became more elaborate, with large wigs and bright coats for men, and beautiful gowns and lace for ladies. Furniture was more finely carved and upholstered with leather. For the first time, many houses were designed with separate rooms for living, eating, and sleeping in. Charles's court, meanwhile, developed a taste for all things French, from clothing to art. Charles II in his finery. Men's clothing was similar to the clothing of Charles I's court, except that boots were replaced with stockings and buckled shoes. Business booms. Trade flourished in the Stuart period, and a flurry of innovations made business easier. Envelopes, newspapers, and insurance were all introduced for the first time. 1694 marked the foundation of the Bank of England, which was established to lend money to the government, and the appearance of the first English banknote. In the early 1600s, coffee arrived in Britain. Coffee houses began springing up in cities from around 1650, and coffee gradually took over from beer as the nation's most popular drink. Coffee houses were soon fashionable places for men to meet and conduct business. At one point, Charles tried to close them all down, as he feared that plotters would use them as meeting places. But his subjects complained so bitterly that he relented. And this shows one of those coffee houses. Trade triangle. Britain's wealth was largely thanks to booming trade overseas. The trade triangle was most valuable. British merchants traded iron and guns for African slaves and then sold them in the New World. Meanwhile, British ships brought home sugar, cotton and tobacco. And there's the trade triangle. House and garden. For an average well-off family in the mid-17th century, life revolved around the house, the home. The father of the household often ran his business from a shop or workshop on the ground floor. The mother looked after the running of the house. Children spent less time at home than their parents, as they were usually sent to be educated at a grander family's house. At midday, the whole household would come together in the wood-panelled main room or hall to eat a large meal. And they would eat a lighter supper in the evening. Houses were lit by fire and candlelight. Candles were very expensive, and few people could afford good quality beeswax candles. Most of the time, they used cheap tallow candles made of animal fat, which smelled unpleasant and filled the house with smoke. Pretty but practical. Richer people had gardens, which provided a welcome escape from the filth and bustle of the town. Most gardens had decorative flowers and trees, and some had ornamental features, such as fountains or sundials. Many of the plants grown had practical uses too. Vegetables were grown alongside herbs for cooking and medicinal purposes. A garden also served as a place where laundry could be hung out to dry. Firewood and water could be stored, and pens could be built to house chickens or pigs to provide extra food for the family. How does your garden grow? Herb gardens were usually planted in geometric beds and included plants which people believed to have medicinal properties. Here are a few plants that were popular in the 17th century and the complaints they were supposed to cure. The bitter herb wormwood was believed to keep away fleas and relieve gout. An infusion of marigolds was drunk to soothe the spirit. Borage was said to drive away sorrow. Feverfew was taken for headaches. Bachelor's buttercups were believed to cure insanity. And there's a picture of the house inside. This is a cloth merchant's house from 1640. Servants lived in basic rooms known as garrets at the top of the house. Bedchambers were often used for entertaining as well as sleeping. The toilet or privy was housed in a shed behind the house. Waste went into a pit underneath, which was emptied at night by men called night soilmen. The rise of science. When the Great Fire happened so quickly after the plague, many people thought it was the work of the devil or a terrible punishment from God. In Stuart times, most people had to rely on religion, superstition, or plain guesswork to try to explain the world around them. But at the same time, intellectuals were making exciting scientific discoveries. Their work would have a huge impact on modern science. The Royal Society. In the 1640s, a group of scientists, including Christopher Wren and Samuel Pepys, began meeting to discuss ideas and perform experiments. They called themselves the Invisible College, and by the 1660s, King Charles had officially recognised their work, and they became the Royal Society. Charles was so interested that he even helped out with some of the experiments. In 1675, he also set up the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, where astronomers studied the sun, moon, and stars. Their work was interesting, but it was also useful. For example, studying the stars helped them to tell the time and navigate at sea. A true genius. In 1703, the Royal Society appointed a new president, Sir Isaac Newton, one of the greatest scientists of all time. One of his most important discoveries was that a force, which we call gravity, pulls objects towards the ground. He realised that gravity was what keeps the moon moving around the earth. Newton was the first person to be knighted for scientific work. And there he is there. He was the first person to suggest that science and mathematics could explain everything. It is said that when he came up with his theory of gravity was when he saw an apple falling from a tree. Newton also made important discoveries about light and invented the mirror telescope to study the stars. Medicine. While Newton and the Royal Society were studying the natural world, doctors were learning more about the human body. Until the 1600s, little had been known about how the body worked or what caused disease. The church wouldn't allow dead bodies to be cut up and examined. Only 1 in 10 people lived to be 40. Operations were done by barber surgeons who set broken bones as well as trimming hair. One common treatment was bleeding, cutting patients open to let out the bad blood that they believed caused illness. However, in the early 17th century, the church finally allowed doctors to cut corpses up to learn more about the body. A physician named William Harvey made one of the most important medical discoveries of all when he uncovered the secret of circulation. He realised that the heart is a pump which makes blood flow around the body. Unfortunately, it took a long time for discoveries like this one to have a real impact, and treatments such as bleeding carried on long after Harvey's death. And that shows doctors examining the arm of a dead man. Witch hunts. Despite new scientific knowledge, many people still believed in witches. In the 1640s, a lawyer named Matthew Hopkins came up with a test to identify witches. The accused was thrown into water. If she drowned, she was innocent. If she lived, she was thought to be a witch and executed. Highly unfair, that one. Inventions. Some Stuart inventions opened the way for a new industrial age. 1701. Jethro Tull's seed drill plants seeds faster than by hand. 1705. Thomas Newcomen's steam engine pumps flood water out of coal mines. 1709. Abraham Darby discovers how to purify coal to make coke. Coke is used as fuel in steel and iron production. A Catholic king. Charles II's extravagant lifestyle eventually caught up with him, and he died in 1685. He was succeeded by his brother James, who believed that God had put him on the throne to convert the country back to Catholicism. James refused to compromise with Parliament on matters of religion, and it wasn't long before this made him extremely unpopular with Protestant politicians and the public. The Monmouth Rebellion. Just 4 months into James's reign, the Protestant Duke of Monmouth, an illegitimate son of Charles II, led a rebellion against him and tried to seize the crown. James's troops quashed the rebels, but it was a hollow victory. Monmouth was executed along with 300 other Protestant rebels, and a further 800 were shipped to Barbados as slaves. The brutal trials became known as the Bloody Assizes. The king's harsh treatment of the defeated rebels made him more unpopular than ever. Challenging the Church. In 1687, James tried to take the law into his own hands, issuing an order called the Declaration of Indulgence to abolish the laws against Catholics. Parliament refused to accept it, which made the king look weak and foolish, but he wouldn't give in. And this is him wearing a wig that was the height of fashion in the 17th century. He ordered the declaration to be read out in every church, and when the bishops protested, he put them on trial. James was humiliated once again when his judges found the bishops not guilty. The final blow. At first, James' critics could console themselves with the thought that he wouldn't be around for long. James was 52 when he came to the throne, an old man by the standards of the day. And when he died, his Protestant daughter, Princess Mary, would be queen. But in 1688, everything changed. James's Catholic second wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son named James. There was a new Catholic heir to the throne, and the Protestants were horrified. Almost immediately, a group of MPs invited Princess Mary's Dutch husband, the Protestant Prince William of Orange, to invade. So on November the 5th, 1688, William landed in Torbay with 15,000 men, forcing James to step down. James fled to France, and William and Mary were crowned king and queen. This dramatic takeover became known as the Glorious Revolution. And there's a picture there. The baby and the warming pan. Some people refused to accept that James's son was really his. Gossip spread that the baby had been smuggled into the Queen's bedroom in a warming pan. William and Mary. William and Mary were appointed by Parliament to reign together. This put an end once and for all to the idea that kings and queens were appointed by God. In 1689, they agreed to limit the powers of the monarchy with a Bill of Rights presented to them by Parliament. It stated that all future monarchs had to be Protestant, and they couldn't keep an army or raise taxes without permission from Parliament, which would have to be called every 3 years. The unpopular Dutchman. Mary was well loved by the British people, but William soon made himself unpopular. He made no secret of the fact that he only wanted the throne so that the British soldiers would fight in a war he was waging against the French. He would spend most of his reign fighting in Europe, leaving Mary alone to rule. The exile returns. The exile James II still had support, especially among Catholics in Ireland and Scotland, and saw that he had one last opportunity to reclaim his crown. In 1689, he landed in Ireland, and with the help of the French and Irish Catholics, tried to seize control from the English Protestants who had settled there. He managed to hold the town of Derry under siege, but his army was no match for William's disciplined troops. On July the 1st, 1690, William defeated him at the Battle of Boyne. What's more, the king gave more land in Northern Ireland to the English Protestants, and Derry was renamed Londonderry. Beaten, James II fled to France and lived there in exile for the rest of his life. Highland Massacre. William didn't want to risk another rebellion, so in 1692 he made the Catholic clans of the Scottish Highlands sign an oath of loyalty to him. When the MacDonalds of Glencoe missed the deadline to sign, 38 members of their clan were massacred by a rival clan, the Campbells, under orders from the government. William alone. In 1694, Mary died of smallpox, leaving William to rule alone. William was devastated by his wife's death and said he had never found a single fault in her. As they had no children, Parliament passed an Act of Settlement in 1701, declaring that Mary's sister Anne and her heirs would succeed to the throne. A year later, William died and Anne became queen. The last Stuart. Queen Anne was a shy woman whose reign was blighted by health problems and personal sadness. She was married to Prince George of Denmark and was frequently pregnant, which made her health even worse. There she is. Anne gave birth to 19 children, but sadly none of them survived. A challenge for Churchill. Early in Queen Anne's reign, Britain joined with Austria and the Netherlands in a war against France and Spain. A young general named John Churchill helped win a series of victories for the British and became a national hero. Queen Anne awarded him with the title Duke of Marlborough and a plot of land where he built a palace named Blenheim, named after one of his most famous battles. His wife Sarah was Anne's closest friend, but eventually the two women fell out and the Queen banished Churchill from public life. Many generations of Churchills have lived at Blenheim Palace. Sir Winston Churchill, Prime Minister during the Second World War, was born here in 1874. The United Kingdom. It soon became clear that Anne would die without any children to succeed her, as some Scottish people still didn't accept the Act of Settlement. Parliament feared that the Scots might try to put James II's son, also called James, on the throne in Scotland. To prevent this, Parliament passed an Act of Union. In 1707, England, Scotland and Wales were united under one Parliament, and from then on the nation became known as the United Kingdom of Great Britain. A new royal family. In 1714, Queen Anne died, and the throne passed to the next in line, George, the son of Princess Sophia of Hanover in Germany, and a great-grandson of James I. Parliament had become stronger during the Tudor and Stuart period, and the powers of the monarchy had gradually declined. But the country George now inherited was one of the most powerful in the world. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you for joining me. I hope to see you soon. Take care, my lovelies. Bye-bye.